Rennala never stopped loving him. That's the worst part. When Radagon left her to marry Marika and become Elden Lord, he shattered her world. He took their children, abandoned their kingdom, and walked away to pursue godhood. And still, when you meet Rennala in the Academy of Raya Lucaria, she cradles the amber egg he left behind, as if it's the only proof that their love was ever real. This is not a story about a villain. This is a story about a woman who loved someone so completely that when he left, there was nothing left of her to hold the pieces together. This is the story of Radagon and Rennala, a romance that began with a hero kneeling before a queen and ended with that queen alone in the dark, singing to an egg that will never hatch. Tonight, I'm going to tell you their full story. From the golden days of their union, when Radagon fought wars in Rennala's name, and she commanded the moon for his glory, to the devastating moment when he chose ambition over love. This is one of the most tragic romances in Elden Ring, and it's a story that stays with you long after. This is the tragic love story of a queen who never recovered. And honestly, how could she? Let's begin. Before the expansionist campaigns of the Erdtree, Liurnia of the Lakes existed as a sovereign geopolitical entity, defined by its geographical isolation and intellectual autonomy. The region was characterized by a permanent celestial fog that served as a natural barrier against external influence, allowing the Carian royals to establish a meritocracy based on lunar observation rather than divine revelation. Such sovereignty was maintained through the Carian Manor, a fortified command center situated on the manor's upper levels, which functioned as the administrative and military heart of the region. The culture was one of quiet, rigid discipline, where power was earned through the mastery of glintstone and the understanding of the stars. The Carian royals were not beholden to the greater will, nor did they acknowledge the authority of the Elden Ring as a governing metaphysical force. Their legitimacy was derived from the moon, a distant and cold celestial body that offered guidance without the parasitic requirements of the Erdtree's grace. This independence created a unique social structure where scholars were the ruling class, and the pursuit of knowledge was considered the highest form of service to the state. The lakes were not a place of worship, but a laboratory where the laws of the universe were interrogated through the lens of sorcery. The military strength of pre-Erdtree Liurnia was rooted in the synthesis of magic and steel, represented by the Carian knights. Though few in number, reportedly fewer than 20, these warriors were capable of repelling entire armies, because their armaments were infused with lunar energy. This era was defined by a specific kind of cold stability. The land was prosperous, the academy was thriving, and the borders were secure. There was no need for a god when the royalty possessed the means to dictate the reality of their own borders. Geographically, the land was a graveyard of ancient civilizations even then, but the Carians utilized these ruins as foundations for their academies and towers. The presence of the albinorics and other artificial life forms suggests that Liurnia was already experimenting with the creation of life outside the Erdtree's cycle of rebirth. This pursuit of artificial or glintstone-based life was a direct challenge to the fundamentalist belief that all life must flow from the Erdtree. Liurnia was a beacon of secular power in a world that was rapidly being consumed by religious zealotry. The independence of Liurnia also meant that its inhabitants were largely immune to the golden grace that began to infect other parts of the continent. They viewed the Erdtree not as a savior, but as a rival predator seeking to monopolize the soul stream of the lands between. This created a tension that was both intellectual and existential. To the Carians, the stars were the true source of fate, and to surrender to the Erdtree was to surrender the very ability to chart one's own destiny. By the time the Golden Order began its march toward the lakes, Liurnia was at its zenith. It was a kingdom of glass, water, and moonlight, holding a monopoly on the most advanced offensive sorceries known to man. It was a civilization that valued the cold and the dark as necessary components of the cosmic order, directly opposing the gold and light of the burgeoning empire to the north. This fundamental ideological divide made the coming conflict not just a war of territory, but a war for the definition of reality itself. Rennala's rise to power was not a result of hereditary succession, but a conquest of intellectual and martial superiority. She entered the Academy of Lucaria as a commoner or a minor noble, but she quickly ascended by bewitching the existing glintstone hierarchy with her discovery of the full moon. This was not a literal charm, but a display of overwhelming magical force that rendered previous glintstone theories obsolete. By manifesting the moon as a tangible, gravitational power, she proved that the Carian line was the only one capable of leading the Academy into a new age. Her mastery of full moon sorcery introduced a new tier of magical application that utilized the moon as a catalyst for neutralizing other spells. This made her effectively invincible against the established sorcerers of the Academy, who relied on the traditional comet and pebble trajectories. Rennala didn't just join the faculty, she subjugated it, she turning a collection of squabbling scholars into a unified political body under her crown. Her charisma was inseparable from her lethality, creating a cult of personality that stabilized Liurnia for generations. Under Rennala's sovereignty, the title of Queen was a functional military rank as much as a social one. She personally led the defense of the land, her presence on the battlefield serving as a psychological deterrent to any who would challenge Carian authority. Her full moon was a symbol of cold, unblinking surveillance, a reminder that the Queen saw everything from her seat in the Grand Library. This era was the only time in history when the Academy and the Carian Manor were in perfect, harmonious alignment. The specific nature of her sorcery also indicates a deep connection to the primeval current. Though she steered the Academy away from the more horrific, body-altering aspects of that study, she brought a sense of royal dignity to magic, moving it away from the frantic, obsessive research of the past and into a structured, disciplined tradition. She was the anchor for the entire region, a woman who had looked into the void of the moon and returned with a mandate to rule. Rennala was also responsible for the expansion of the Carian influence into the surrounding marshes and towers. She established the system of glintstone keys and the complex bureaucracy of the Academy, ensuring that only those who proved their merit could access the deeper secrets of the stars. She was a gatekeeper in the most literal sense, controlling the flow of information and power within her kingdom with an iron hand wrapped in silk. However, the source of her power was also her greatest vulnerability. Her authority was tied directly to her mental fortitude and her connection to the moon. In this period, she was the champion of the moon, a figure of such immense gravitational presence that even the stars seemed to align with her will. She was the peak of human achievement in sorcery, a mortal who had achieved the status of a living goddess through sheer force of intellect and ambition, standing as the final obstacle to the Erdtree's total dominance. At its height, the Academy of Lucaria was the premier center for ontological and cosmological research in the lands between. It operated as a meritocracy, where social standing was irrelevant compared to one's ability to perceive and manipulate glintstone. The institution was divided into various consorts or houses, each specializing in a different branch of sorcery: Karalos, Lazuli, Olivinus, creating a competitive but highly productive intellectual ecosystem. This was a city of the mind, where the sound of chanting and the glow of blue crystals defined the rhythm of daily life. The political structure of the academy was intrinsically linked to its academic output. The Heimer scholars acted as the academy's internal police and frontline battle mages, ensuring that the pursuit of knowledge was never interrupted by mundane, civil unrest. This created a society that was highly efficient, but increasingly detached from the human experience. The scholars lived in a state of constant immersion in the primeval current, a pursuit that often led to the loss of their own humanity in exchange for cosmic insight. Raya Lucaria's peak was also marked by its role as a neutral ground for the world's elite. Leaders and thinkers from across the continent traveled to the lakes to study under the Carians, making Liurnia the intellectual capital of the world. The academy held the secrets of life, death, and the movement of the heavens, giving it a soft power that rivaled the hard power of the Golden Order. Knowledge was the currency, and the academy was the wealthiest bank in existence. The physical architecture of the academy reflected this period of grandiosity. The sprawling complex of bridges, elevators, and libraries was designed to facilitate the constant flow of information. The Grand Library was the nerve center, housing every major breakthrough in sorcery since the age of the astrologers. It was a monument to the belief that the universe was a puzzle that could be solved through logic and rigorous observation. The academy also maintained a complex relationship with the Cuckoo mercenaries during this time. While the Carian Knights were the elite guard, the academy required a larger standing force to protect its interests in the surrounding lakes. This was the beginning of a dangerous reliance on outside military power. But at the peak of Rennala's reign, these mercenaries were kept firmly in check by the Queen's overwhelming magical presence. The Cuckoo was a tool, not yet a threat. Ultimately, the academy at its peak represented a dream of human transcendence. It was the belief that through the study of glintstone, the amber of the cosmos, humanity could bypass the need for divine intervention and achieve a state of pure intellectual being. It was a civilization built on the edge of a precipice, staring into the infinite dark of space and finding it more comforting than the blinding light of the Erdtree. The expansion of the Golden Order was an inevitability driven by the biological and metaphysical hunger of the Erdtree. Queen Marika's campaign was not merely about land, it was about the total integration of all life into a single, unified system. When the Golden Order's gaze fell upon Liurnia, it saw a pocket of resistance that challenged the claim that the Erdtree was the sole source of truth. The march toward the lakes was a crusade to extinguish the competing light of the moon and replace it with the unblinking radiance of gold. The First and Second Liurnian Wars were the first times the Golden Order encountered a force it could not simply overwhelm with numbers or religious fervor. The Carian sorcerers utilized the geography of the lakes to their advantage, turning the fog and water into conduits for long-range magical bombardment. The Golden Order's heavy plate and slow-moving formations were decimated by the precision and range of glintstone sorcery. For the first time, the grace of the Erdtree found itself stalled in the mud of the marshes. Marika's commanders were forced to realize that the Carians were not barbarians to be converted, but an advanced military power with a superior grasp of the physical laws of combat. The stalemate was a humiliation for the Leyndell forces, who were used to the total submission of their enemies. Every time the Golden Order attempted to cross the gates, they were met with the great blade phalanx and the cold, calculated fury of Rennala's leadership. The war was a grinding, expensive failure for the capital. The conflict also highlighted the ideological gap between the two powers. The Golden Order fought with the certainty of faith, believing their victory was preordained by the greater will. The Carians fought with the certainty of mathematics, calculating the exact trajectory needed to pierce a knight's visor from a mile away. It was a clash between the emotional power of the sun and the rational power of the moon. The Erdtree's expansion was halted by the simple fact that sorcery was more efficient at killing than prayer. During these wars, the Leyndell forces began to experiment with their own anti-magic measures, leading to the development of the first barrier incantations. However, these were reactive measures that failed to turn the tide. The stalemate lasted for years, creating a border of charred earth and sunken armor where the woods met the water. Liurnia remained a fortress, its towers gleaming in the dark as a middle finger to the Erdtree's ambition. The failure to conquer Liurnia through traditional means forced a change in the Golden Order's strategy. If the moon could not be eclipsed by force, it would have to be subverted from within. This led to the emergence of a new kind of champion, one who did not lead with a sword alone, but with a complex, metaphysical identity that could bridge the gap between gold and silver. The stage was set for the arrival of Radagon. Radagon appeared on the battlefield as a tactical anomaly, a red-haired champion of unknown origin who possessed a genius for both martial combat and fundamentalist logic. Unlike the previous commanders who relied on brute force, Radagon approached the Liurnian problem as a puzzle to be solved. He was the embodiment of Golden Order fundamentalism, before it was even a formalized doctrine, rigid, analytical, and entirely devoted to the principle of regression, the idea that all things must eventually return to a single source. His red hair was a striking, almost jarring physical trait that he reportedly loathed, seeing it as a curse or a mark of the giants he had helped to exterminate. This self-loathing manifested as an obsessive drive for perfection and order. He didn't just want to win the war, he wanted to fix the error of Liurnian independence. He carried a golden hammer and wore armor that was as much a mathematical statement as it was protection, symbolizing the uncompromising nature of the law he served. Radagon's effectiveness on the battlefield was due to his ability to adapt. He studied his enemies with a cold, detached intensity, learning the rhythms of their sorcery so he could better counter them. He was a champion of law, believing that the universe operated on fixed principles that could be mastered. While Marika was the god of the order, Radagon was its technician, the one responsible for the day-to-day enforcement of its reality. His devotion to the Golden Order was absolute, bordering on the fanatical. He didn't seek personal glory or the spoils of war. He sought the total unification of the lands between under the greater will. To Radagon, the existence of the Carian royals was a leak in the system that needed to be plugged. He was a man of action and order, a perfect tool for a deity that needed to expand its influence into the intellectual heart of the world. Despite his rigid nature, Radagon possessed a strange, magnetic presence that allowed him to command respect even from his enemies. He was a hero in the classical, terrifying sense. A man who could not be bribed, tired, or turned away. His arrival changed the atmospheric pressure of the Liurnian Wars. The conflict stopped being a series of skirmishes and became a high-stakes duel between the Champion of Gold and the Queen of the Moon. Radagon represented the will of the Erdtree in its most concentrated form. He was the projection of Marika's ambition, sent to do what the regular armies could not. His presence in Liurnia was the first step in a long-term plan to absorb the power of the stars into the architecture of the Golden Order. He was the red-haired shadow of a god, moving across the fog of the lakes with a purpose that Rennala, for all her wisdom, did not yet fully grasp. The Liurnian Wars are historically categorized as a stalemate of gold and silver, a conflict where neither side could achieve a decisive breakthrough. The Golden Order's incantations, powered by faith and the Erdtree's vitality, clashed directly with the Carian sorceries, which were fueled by the intellect and the cold energy of the stars. This was a war of attrition, where the very atmosphere of the lakes became a battlefield of competing energies. The golden light of Radagon's army met the silver mist of Rennala's defense, creating a spectral, deadly environment that claimed thousands of lives on both sides. Tactically, the wars were defined by the contrast between Radagon's rigid, fundamentalist formations and Rennala's fluid, adaptive magical strikes. Radagon's forces utilized great shields and golden vow incantations to create a slow-moving, impenetrable wall of light. In response, Rennala's sorcerers used Loretta's great bow and glintstone phalanx to rain down high-velocity projectiles from the safety of the fog. It was a war of pressure versus precision, with neither side willing to yield an inch of the sodden, marshy ground. The psychological toll of the wars was immense. The Golden Order soldiers were fighting in a land where the very stars seemed to be hostile, while the Carian scholars were forced to militarize their pursuit of knowledge to an exhausting degree. The stalemate was not a passive state, but a high-tension standoff, where one mistake meant total annihilation. Radagon and Rennala met on the field multiple times, their individual prowess serving as the focal point for their respective armies. Each encounter was a display of peak metaphysical output, further cementing their status as the two most powerful beings in the region. This era also saw the first major integration of glintstone knights into the Carian military, a move necessitated by the sheer endurance of the Golden Order's knights. The wars forced both civilizations to evolve their technology and magic at an accelerated rate. Innovations in magic grease and anti-magic shields became standard issue. The lakes were no longer a place of serenity. They were a laboratory of death where the gold and silver were being tested to their absolute limits. The Second Liurnian War specifically brought the conflict to the very gates of the Academy. Radagon's persistence began to wear down the Carian defenses, even as his own losses mounted. It became clear to both leaders that a total victory for either side would result in the complete destruction of the land they were fighting over. The war had reached a point of diminishing returns, where the cost of conquest was starting to exceed the value of the prize. The Liurnian Wars ended not with a final battle, but with a sudden, localized cessation of hostilities that paved the way for a diplomatic resolution. The constant friction between the two powers had created a strange kind of mutual respect, or perhaps a mutual exhaustion. The gold could not break the silver, and the silver could not drive out the gold. The stalemate had become the status quo, and it required a radical shift in perspective to break the cycle of violence. The final confrontation between Radagon and Rennala is one of the most significant single events in the history of the Lands Between, marking the transition from territorial war to metaphysical union. The duel took place at the site that would eventually become the Church of Vows, a neutral ground between the two warring territories. While the historical records are sparse on the specific combat maneuvers, it is understood that the duel was not a fight to the death, but a clash of wills that ended in an unprecedented act of repentance. Radagon, the seemingly inflexible champion of the Golden Order, chose to cease his assault. In a move that shocked his own fundamentalist followers, Radagon performed a ritual of celestial dew, cleansing himself of the territorial aggression he had championed for years. This act was a formal acknowledgement of sin, an admission that the Golden Order's attempt to forcibly conquer Liurnia was an error in the Order itself. By washing away his bellicose intent, Radagon was signaling a desire for regression in a new form, the merging of two seemingly incompatible truths. He didn't destroy Rennala because he realized that her moon was a necessary component of the completeness he sought. Rennala's reaction to this gesture was equally transformative. She had spent her life as a conqueror and a defender, viewing the world through the cold, objective lens of the moon. Radagon's sudden vulnerability and his offer of peace bewitched her in a way that no sorcery ever could. The warrior queen saw in the red-haired champion a reflection of her own intensity and discipline. The duel shifted from a combat of spells to a negotiation of souls, resulting in a cessation of hostilities that no political treaty could have achieved. The theological implications of the duel were staggering. For a champion of the Golden Order to repent was almost heresy, yet Radagon's actions were framed as a pursuit of a higher logic. He was looking for the whole, and he realized the Erdtree was incomplete without the wisdom of the stars. The duel was the moment the red and the silver stopped trying to erase each other and began to contemplate what they could build together. It was a moment of profound clarity in a world defined by the fog of war. The Church of Vows was established on this spot to commemorate the event, housing a statue of the miracle of their union. The duel proved that even the most rigid fundamentalism could be softened by the presence of a great rune of love or curiosity. However, from a mechanical perspective, it was also a tactical masterstroke. By marrying Rennala, Radagon achieved what the entire Leyndal army could not: the total integration of Liurnia into the Golden Order without losing another soldier. The duel was the end of Rennala the Conqueror and the beginning of Rennala the Wife. She laid down her staff in favor of a ring, believing that she had found a partner who was her equal in every way. The red-haired champion had successfully breached the Academy's walls, not through the gates, but through the heart of its queen. The duel was the ultimate victory for the Golden Order, though it was disguised as a romantic surrender. The marriage between Radagon and Rennala at the Church of Vows was the most significant political merger in the history of the Lands Between. It effectively ended the era of conquest and ushered in a brief golden age of stability. The union was sealed with the exchange of gifts. Rennala gave Radagon the Moonlight Greatsword, a Carian tradition for spouses, and Radagon brought the influence of the Erdtree into the Grand Library. This was not just a wedding. It was a merger of two massive operating systems that had previously been at war. For the populace of Liurnia and Leyndell, the marriage was a relief. The trade routes through the lakes were reopened, and the constant threat of magical bombardment vanished. This peace allowed for a cultural exchange that enriched both societies. Golden Order knights studied alongside glintstone sorcerers, leading to a period of unprecedented intellectual growth. The peace was a tangible, physical reality that could be seen in the new architecture and the shared festivals that celebrated the union of the sun and the moon. However, beneath the surface of the celebrations, the marriage was a complex web of political necessity. For the Golden Order, it was the only way to stabilize a volatile region and secure the northern borders. For the Carians, it was a way to maintain their autonomy while being part of a larger, more powerful empire. The love between Radagon and Rennala was the glue that held this fragile alliance together, making the personal relationship of the two leaders the single most important factor in global stability. Radagon's role in Liurnia during this time was that of a consort king, but he functioned more like a scholar in residence. He spent much of his time in the academy, not as a conqueror, but as a student. This was the era of fundamentalism in its most literal sense, the study of the foundations of reality. He sought to find the mathematical law that connected his faith to Rennala's sorcery. This intellectual curiosity made him a beloved figure in the academy, further solidifying the peace. Rennala, for her part, seemed to have found a sense of peace that had eluded her during her rise to power. She was no longer the lone wolf guarding the moon. She was a partner in a grander cosmic experiment. Her full moon was now joined by the golden light, and for a time she believed that the two could coexist in perfect balance. She was a queen at the height of her domestic and political power, presiding over a kingdom that had successfully navigated the threat of total war. This period of peace is the baseline against which the later tragedy is measured. It was a moment in time where order and mystery were not enemies. The marriage was the peak of the lands between civilization, a brief flash of harmony before the inherent contradictions of the Golden Order and the secret identity of Radagon began to pull the world apart. The peace through marriage was a beautiful, successful lie that everyone, including Rennala, desperately wanted to believe. The unification of the moon and the Erdtree resulted in the birth of Golden Order fundamentalism, a philosophical and magical tradition that treated the laws of the universe as a rigid, observable system. This era saw the creation of new tools and incantations that required both intelligence and faith, signaling a collapse of the traditional boundaries between science and religion. The Radagon's rings of light and other such spells were the physical manifestations of this era, bright, circular, and mathematically perfect. In the Grand Library, the blending of these two traditions led to a revolution in the understanding of the Elden Ring. Scholars began to view the ring not just as a divine object, but as a complex formula that governed all life. This intellectual harmony was the Golden Age of Liurnia, where the cold logic of the stars was used to refine the warm devotion of the Erdtree. It was a time of symmetry, where the lunar cycles were mapped against the growth of the Erdtree's roots, finding a common language in the geometry of the cosmos. This unification also had a profound impact on the children of the era, not just the biological offspring of the royalty, but the children of the mind born from this new philosophy. The Academy began to produce scholars who were equally comfortable with a glintstone staff and a sacred seal. This hybrid class of intellectuals was intended to be the future of the lands between. a new generation that would transcend the old conflicts of gold and silver. The world was becoming a singular, ordered place. The symbolism of this era was pervasive. The architecture of the period often featured the eclipse or the intertwined roots and moonbeams, representing the total integration of the two powers. This wasn't just aesthetic, it was a psychological rebranding of reality. The greater will was no longer a distant, alien force. It was now presented as the logical conclusion of all lunar study. The moon was no longer a rival. It was a secondary body in the hierarchy of the Erdtree. However, this unification was also a process of subsumption. By bringing the moon into the Golden Order, Radagon was effectively domesticating the mystery of Liurnia. The primeval current was sidelined in favor of fundamentalist law. While this brought stability, it also removed the chaos that allowed for true innovation. The union was a freezing of Liurnian culture, turning a living, breathing tradition of lunar exploration into a static, golden museum piece. Despite this, the period remains the only time in history when the lands between felt complete. The moon, Erdtree united, was the highest expression of the Golden Order's potential to bring peace through total integration. It was a vision of a world where everything had its place. Every star was accounted for, and every soul was part of the Erdtree's great design. For Rennala, this was the fulfillment of her destiny. For Radagon, it was another step toward his own secret perfection. The biological union of Radagon and Rennala produced 3 children who would become some of the most influential and destructive figures in history: Radagon, Rykard, and Ranni. Each child inherited a specific aspect of their parents' divergent natures, serving as a living map of the tensions within the gold and silver marriage. They were born into a world of immense privilege and power, raised in the Grand Library and the Carian Manor as the heirs to a unified kingdom. Their existence was the ultimate proof that the union of the moon and Erdtree was physically viable. Radagon, the eldest, was the embodiment of his father's red vitality and his mother's celestial power. He was a lion who worshipped the martial prowess of Radagon and the Golden Order, yet he travelled to Celicia to study gravity sorcery, a Carian-adjacent discipline. Radagon's life was an attempt to reconcile the might of the Erdtree with the mystery of the stars. He was a son who loved both his parents' legacies, styling his armor after the red lion of his father, while holding the stars in place with the magic of his mother's land. Rykard, the second son, took on the role of the Inquisitor, inheriting the analytical, legalistic mind of Radagon. He was the one responsible for the judicial enforcement of the New Order, a role that likely exposed him to the darker, more hypocritical aspects of the Golden Order's bureaucracy. Rykard's path was one of rigid justice that would eventually curd into blasphemy. He was a child of the law who found the law wanting, a direct reflection of Radagon's own cold, uncompromising nature. Ranni, the only daughter, was the true heir to the lunar legacy of Rennala. She was the princess of the moon, a figure of quiet, immense magical potential, who was eventually chosen by the Two Fingers as an Empyrean, a candidate to succeed Marika. Ranni was the child who felt the cold of the moon most deeply, inheriting her mother's independence and her father's strategic genius. She was the bridge between the human royalty and the divine Empyreans, a position that would eventually lead her to destroy the very world her parents had built. The childhood of these 3 siblings in the Grand Library was the last time the Carian family existed as a functional unit. They were the golden children of a new era, symbols of a future where the shattering was an impossibility. Their presence in the academy provided a sense of continuity and stability for the scholars, who saw the royal children as the living embodiment of their academic pursuits. They were the princes and princesses of a world that was, for a brief moment, perfect. However, the seeds of their future rebellions were planted in this very upbringing. By being raised at the intersection of two massive competing ideologies, the children were forced to choose which part of their heritage they valued most. They were not whole beings, but fractured ones, each carrying a piece of the red and the silver that would eventually lead them to tear the lands between apart. Their birth was the high point of the marriage, but their destinies were the shattering in waiting. Radagon's presence in Liurnia was characterized by an outward performance of integration that masked a fundamental internal divergence. Despite his marriage to the Lunar Queen, Radagon never transitioned into a Carian. Instead, he treated the Grand Library as a laboratory for his own spiritual completion. His study of sorcery was not an act of cultural appreciation, but a calculated effort to master the logic of the world so he could better serve the faith of the Golden Order. He remained a creature of the Erdtree, obsessed with the concept of totalities, the idea that a true god must encompass all competing disciplines to ensure the absolute stability of the law. For this secret devotion was evidenced by his private rituals and his refusal to abandon his fundamentalist roots. While he wore the mask of a consort, he was internally refining the Golden Order seals and developing incantations that would eventually allow the Erdtree to absorb the very concepts he was ostensibly learning from the Carians. To Radagon, sorcery was a tool to be dismantled and reassembled into a more perfect version of the Golden Order. He was a spy in his own home, gathering the intellectual data required to ensure that the moon could eventually be rendered obsolete by the sun. The tension of this double life created a subtle but pervasive atmosphere of unease within the royal household. Radagon's devotion was cold and mechanical, lacking the organic warmth that Rennala expected from a partner. He was often found alone, staring into the golden light of his own creation, rather than the silver glow of the moon. His children witnessed a father who was physically present but spiritually anchored to a capital city he had supposedly left behind. He was a man of the order first and a husband second, a priority that would eventually dictate the catastrophic trajectory of his departure. Beyond his personal studies, Radagon's devotion manifested in the slow restructuring of Liurnian law. He began introducing fundamentalist principles into the Academy's curriculum, subtly shifting the focus from the exploration of the primeval current to the observation of causality and regression. This was an intellectual invasion intended to align the free-thinking sorcerers with the rigid dogmas of the greater will. He was not just a husband, for he was an ambassador for a parasitic ideology, quietly laying the groundwork for the eventual erasure of Carian sovereignty. His physical appearance during this time remained a constant reminder of his alien origin. The red hair, which he viewed as a mark of a cursed lineage, stood in stark contrast to the silver and blue aesthetics of the Carian royalty. This visual dissonance mirrored the metaphysical dissonance of his presence. He was a foreign object lodged in the heart of Liurnia, a piece of gold that refused to be tarnished by the silver. His secret devotion ensured that he was always a guest in his own kingdom, never truly belonging to the land or the woman he claimed to love. Ultimately, Radagon's devotion was a pursuit of a perfected self that required the exploitation of Rennala's knowledge. He used her to fill the gaps in his own understanding of the cosmos, treating her wisdom as a resource to be harvested. This mechanical approach to their relationship meant that the cracks were present from the very beginning. The marriage was not a union of equals, but a strategic acquisition by a man whose only true loyalty was to the Golden Order. By the time the call from Leyndell came, Radagon had already mentally left Liurnia years prior. Part 12. Rennala's growing isolation. As Radagon's obsession with completeness deepened, Rennala found herself increasingly sidelined within her own kingdom. The vibrant, charismatic queen who had conquered the academy began to withdraw into the upper levels of the Grand Library, sensing that her husband's heart was elsewhere. The intellectual harmony they had shared was replaced by a sterile academic partnership where Radagon spent more time with his scrolls than with his wife. This isolation was not just emotional, but political, as the Queen's withdrawal allowed external and internal pressures to begin eroding the Carian authority. Rennala's retreat into lunar studies became a form of psychological defense against the growing golden influence in her court. She sensed that the Erdtree was not just a partner, but a parasite, slowly rewriting the laws of Liurnia to suit its own expansionist needs. Her full moon, once a symbol of her absolute sovereignty, began to feel like a cold, distant comfort as she watched Radagon's fundamentalism slowly suffocate the traditional glintstone arts. She was a woman losing her grip on her reality, undistracted by the very mystery that had once made her powerful. This period of isolation marked the beginning of the end for the Carian dynasty's stability. A monarch who is not seen is a monarch who can be challenged. By retreating from the public eye to nurse her growing sense of abandonment, Rennala inadvertently signaled to the Academy and the Cuckoo Knights that the crown was weak. She was no longer the warrior queen on the battlefield. She was a ghost in the library, haunted by the suspicion that her marriage was merely the final, successful siege of her kingdom. The lack of physical presence in the Grand Library led to a breakdown in the administrative functions of the Academy. Without Rennala to mediate the disputes between the various consorts, the scholars began to form factions, some aligning with Radagon's new fundamentalism out of a desire for advancement. This eroded the Queen's base of support, leaving her isolated even amongst her own people. She became a figure of pity rather than one of fear, a shift that is catastrophic for any ruler whose power is built on charisma and martial brilliance. Furthermore, the isolation extended to her relationship with her children. While she loved them, she could not hide the fact that they were constant reminders of the man who was slowly pulling away from her. This created a household of shadows, where the children were left to navigate the competing ideologies of their parents on their own. Rennala's silence was a vacuum that Radagon's Golden Order was more than happy to fill. The isolation was a slow-acting poison that paralyzed the Carian heart before the final blow was even struck. By the end of this period, Rennala was a queen in name only. She had allowed the moon to become a source of sorrow rather than a source of strength. The isolation was the precursor to her eventual mind break, a period of mourning for a marriage that was still technically functioning. She was experiencing the shattering on a personal level long before the Elden Ring was ever broken. The cracks beneath the surface had become chasms, and Rennala was trapped on the side that was slowly sinking into the dark. Part 13. The Cuckoo Knights and Political Fracture. The Knights of the Cuckoo were the primary military force of the Academy, mercenaries who had never shared the Carian family's deep and ancestral connection to the moon. During the height of the marriage, they were kept in check by the combined power of Radagon and Rennala. But as the queen withdrew and the king's focus shifted to Leyndell, these knights began to see the Carians as a liability. They viewed the marriage as a golden infection that had weakened the purity of glintstone scholarship. The cuckoo, a bird that lays its eggs in the nests of others, became a fitting symbol for a military force that intended to steal the kingdom from within. Political fracture became visible in the way the Academy's consorts began to squabble over funding and ideological direction. The Lazuli and Karalos houses started to diverge, with some favouring the Golden Order's new fundamentalism and others clinging to the old primeval current. Without Rennala's active leadership to bridge these gaps, the Academy became a tinderbox of resentment. The Cuckoo Knights exploited this chaos, positioning themselves as the true protectors of Raya Lucaria, while secretly plotting to imprison the royal family that had hired them. The fracture was also fueled by the perception that Liurnia had become a vassal state of Leyndell. The pride of the Glintstone scholars was wounded by the fact that their queen had married the man who had failed to conquer them by force. To the Cuckoo Knights, the peace was a surrender. They began to hoard glintstone and build their own fortifications, preparing for a civil war that they believed was necessary to purify the lakes. The cracks beneath the surface were no longer just psychological. They were manifested in the sharpening of swords and the quiet betrayal of the Queen's Guard. Internally, the Academy's meritocracy collapsed into a system of patronage and political maneuvering. Scholars who showed loyalty to the Golden Order were granted access to restricted research, while those loyal to the Carian line were marginalized. This created a brain drain within the institution, as the most brilliant minds were forced to choose between their academic integrity and their survival. The Cuckoo Knights, sensing this instability, began to exert more direct control over the Academy's gates, effectively turning the center of learning into a fortified encampment. This period saw the rise of anti-Carian sentiment as a legitimate political movement within Liurnia. Jah the Cuckoo became a symbol of resistance against what was perceived as an alien, royal imposition on the natural order of glintstone study. The Knights fostered this sentiment, using it to justify their eventual seizure of power. They were no longer the servants of the moon, but the masters of the Academy, waiting for the perfect moment to discard the queen who had become a burden to their ambitions. The fracture was finalized when the Knights began to ignore Carian directives entirely. They operated as an independent state within the lakes, taxing the local population and conducting their own military operations. The Cuckoo had successfully hatched in the Carian nest, and the original inhabitants were being pushed out. This was a catastrophic failure of the Carian political model, which had relied on the personal power of the monarch to keep the disparate elements of the kingdom in alignment. Without that power, the kingdom was nothing more than a collection of warring factions. Princess Rani, the most perceptive of the three children, was the first to recognize the parasitic nature of the greater will. While her brothers, Radan and Rykard, sought to find their place within the existing power structures, Rani began a quiet, methodical rejection of the fate being laid out for her. She saw the Golden Order not as a bringer of peace, but as a rigid cage that sought to dictate the movement of the stars. Even as a child, she sought out the Snow Witch in the hidden woods, learning a brand of cold, a lunar sorcery that was separate from both her mother's academy and her father's golden law. Her rebellion was initially intellectual, manifested in her refusal to participate in the fundamentalist rituals her father attempted to introduce to the Carian household. She remained fiercely loyal to the moon, but she saw that her mother's version of lunar worship was too passive to survive the Erdtree's hunger. Ranni's early rebellion was a search for a third path, a way to exist that was neither gold nor silver, but something entirely outside the influence of the fingers. She was the only member of the family who truly understood that Radagon's presence in Liurnia was a death sentence for their independence. This early defiance created a profound rift between Ranni and her father. While Radagon saw Ranni as a potential Empyrean successor who could further unify the world, Ranni saw her father as a puppet of a distant, uncaring god. She began to distance herself from the Carian manor, spending her time in the Three Sisters' towers, plotting a future that involved the total destruction of the order her parents had fought so hard to build. Her rebellion was the ultimate cracks beneath the surface, a daughter preparing to murder the world of her father to save the soul of her mother. Ranni's rejection of her Empyrean status was the core of her early strategy. She understood that to be an Empyrean was to be a vessel for the greater will, a fate she considered worse than death. She spent years researching the Night of Black Knives, looking for a way to slay her own flesh without destroying her soul. This was a cold, calculated rebellion that required her to alienate herself from everyone she loved. She viewed her father's marriage to her mother as a cautionary tale of what happens when the moon allows itself to be touched by gold. Her relationship with her mother during this time was one of tragic observation. She watched Rennala wither under Radagon's neglect, and this fueled her hatred for the Golden Order. Ranni realized that her mother's full moon was a reflection, whereas Ranni sought to become the dark moon, a force that could hide from the Erdtree's all-seeing light. Her rebellion was a survival mechanism for the Carian legacy, even if it meant she had to burn the world down to protect what was left of it. By the time the political fracture of Liurnia was complete, Ranni had already established her own shadow government within the Three Sisters. She had her own advisors, her own knights, and her own agenda. She was no longer a princess of the Golden Order. She was a sovereign of the dark. Her early rebellion ensured that when the shattering finally occurred, she was the only one with a plan to escape the wreckage. She was the dark that Radagon could not master, and the moon that Rennala was too broken to see. Part 15. The Call from Lendel. The stability of the lands between was shattered when the first Elden Lord, Godfrey, was stripped of his grace and banished along with his warriors. This created a vacuum of power in the capital that required an immediate divine solution. Queen Marika issued a summons that reached across the fog of the lakes to the Grand Library. Radagon was to return to Lendel to become the second Elden Lord and King Consort. To the world, this looked like a promotion, but to the Carian family, it was the sounding of a death knell. The call from Lendel was not an invitation. It was a recall of a tool that had finished its work in the north. Radagon's response to the summons was immediate and devoid of any apparent hesitation. There were no prolonged negotiations, no attempts to bring Rennala with him, and no debate over the abandonment of his children. His secret devotion to the Order finally eclipsed his role as a husband. He prepared to leave Liurnia with the same cold, tactical efficiency with which he had arrived. The call proved that his time in the lakes had been a mission, not a life. He had mastered the sorcery of the moon, he had secured the borders, and now he was needed to stabilize the core of the empire. The news of the summons sent the academy into a state of shock. The scholars, who had grown comfortable with the golden peace, suddenly realized that their security was tied entirely to a man who was now walking away. The call exposed the fragility of the Union. It was a reminder that in the eyes of the greater will, Liurnia was a secondary concern, a conquered province to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. Radagon was returning to the gold, leaving the silver to rot in the dark. From a mechanical perspective, the call was the activation of a sleeper agent. Radagon had spent his time in Liurnia, gathering the intellectual property of the Carians, and now he was bringing it back to the capital to integrate it into the Elden Ring. His departure was a data transfer, leaving the source terminal, Rennala, empty and corrupted. The call was the signal that the merger was complete, and the subsidiary, Liurnia, was being liquidated. Radagon's lack of emotion during this transition was the ultimate proof of his fundamentalist nature. The abandonment was felt most acutely by the children, who were essentially left as geopolitical orphans. Radagon and Rennala were left to reconcile their father's greatness with his sudden desertion, while Ranni saw her darkest suspicions confirmed. The call from Leyndell was the moment the family was officially sacrificed on the altar of the Golden Order. It was a cold, bureaucratic decision that ignored the human cost, proving that the Order valued structural integrity over emotional reality. The departure of Radagon also signaled to the rest of the lands between that the era of peace was over. The movement of the red-haired champion back to the capital was a mobilization of power that left the lakes vulnerable. The call was the trigger for the civil war that would soon consume Liurnia. By taking Radagon away, Marika ensured that the academy and the manor would destroy each other, leaving no rivals to the throne in the south. The call was a masterclass in divine sabotage, executed with the precision of a guillotine. The departure of Radagon from Liurnia was not marked by conflict or dramatic farewells, but by a chilling, absolute silence. He simply ceased to be a husband and became a king. He walked out of the grand library, leaving behind his children and his wife without a single recorded word of regret. This was the ultimate expression of his fundamentalist nature. When the law dictates a change, the individual must comply without emotion. He left behind his moonlight greatsword, a symbolic rejection of the Carian tradition, and took up the mantle of the Elden Lord. As a final, parting gift, Radagon left Rennala with the Amber Egg, which contained the great rune of the unborn. To a grieving woman, this might have looked like a promise of future life or a token of affection, but analytically, it was a cruel replacement for his presence. It was a biological anchor, intended to keep her occupied while he returned to his true source. The egg was a mechanical substitute for a husband, a tool of rebirth given to a woman whose life had just been effectively ended. It was the final move in Radagon's tactical withdrawal, ensuring Rennala remained trapped in the library while he moved on to Leyndell. The abandonment was the catalyst for the total collapse of the Carian social order. The moment the red-haired champion crossed the border out of Liurnia, the peace evaporated. The Cuckoo Knights saw their opening, and the Academy scholars saw their queen as a discarded object. Radagon's departure was a public execution of Rennala's dignity. He didn't need to kill her. By leaving her, he ensured that she would be destroyed by the very people she had led. The silence of his departure was the loudest sound in the history of the lakes. The physical act of leaving was a rejection of everything Liurnia stood for. By leaving his Carian equipment behind, Radagon was stating that the silver was no longer useful to him. He was returning to his pure gold state, shedding the skin of the consort. This abandonment was a metaphysical amputation, leaving Rennala as a phantom limb of a god who no longer needed her. The gift of the egg was the final insult, a piece of the Elden ring used to pacify a woman while her kingdom was being dismantled by her husband's colleagues in Lendel. Rennala's reaction to the departure was a total cessation of her administrative duties. She watched him walk away from the balcony of the Grand Library, and she never truly moved from that spot again. The abandonment was so total that it left her without the ability to even protest. She was a master of the stars who had been blindsided by a man, a realization that was too much for her intellect to process. She was left to cradle a stone egg while her husband was crowned as the ruler of the world she had once defied. The children were left to pick up the pieces of a broken dynasty. Radagon's departure forced them into adulthood in a world that was suddenly hostile. The abandonment was not just of a wife, but of a future. Radagon left them with nothing but their names and the legacy of a failed union. He walked into the sun, leaving them in the cold fog of the lakes to find their own way. The departure was the definitive end of the Carian era, a moment of absolute transition that turned the Grand Library into a mausoleum. Part 17. The Revelation. Radagon is Marika. The metaphysical reality of the lands between is anchored in the fact that Radagon is Marika. They are not two separate individuals who married for political gain, but two aspects of the same divine being, separated to perform specific tasks before being pulled back into a singular form. This revelation recontextualizes the entire Liurnian campaign not as a romance, but as a god's internal struggle to achieve completeness. Marika needed to absorb the wisdom and power of the moon, so she manifested Radagon to go and collect it. The marriage was a divine research trip, a biological and intellectual heist carried out by a being who could not be satisfied with the Erdtree alone. This truth renders the love story entirely fraudulent. Radagon didn't love Rennala because Radagon was not a whole person capable of human love. He was a fragment of a god's ambition. His devotion to the Golden Order was actually a devotion to his own source. When he was called back to Lendel, it wasn't a man returning to his queen. It was a limb returning to a body. The Radagon is Marika twist turns the history of Liurnia into a cruel joke played on a mortal woman by a god who needed a temporary vessel for her expansionist goals. The Amber Egg further proves this mechanical intent. The great rune of the unborn was a piece of the Elden ring, a literal part of Marika/Radagon's own body, left behind to monitor or stabilize the region. By giving Rennala the egg, Radagon was leaving a part of himself behind to act as a placeholder. And this revelation means that even when they were in bed together, Rennala was alone. She was married to a shadow, a red-haired projection of a goddess who was simultaneously ruling a capital city and planning the conquest of the world. The revelation also explains Radagon's obsession with regression. If he is Marika, then his marriage to Rennala was a form of externalization that he eventually had to pull back in. He was returning to himself. This turns the entire Liurnian era into a minor chapter in Marika's long-term plan for total dominance. The moon was just a flavor of power that she wanted to sample before moving on. This ontological horror is the true tragedy of Rennala's life. She was a queen who was used as a stepping stone for a god's self-actualization. Furthermore, the Radagon is Marika. Truth explains why Radagon was so effective at mastering both sorcery and incantations. He had the innate capacity of a god to hold conflicting realities in his mind. He wasn't learning sorcery so much as he was adapting it into his own divine framework. The marriage was a synthesis of power, but it was a one-way street. The Golden Order gained the wisdom of the moon, but the moon gained nothing but a broken heart and a stone egg. The revelation is the final nail in the coffin of Liurnian dignity. Ultimately, the revelation means that there was never any peace through marriage. There was only conquest through marriage. Radagon was the Trojan horse of the Golden Order, and Rennala was the one who opened the gates. By the time the truth came out, or rather, by the time it was made manifest in the shattering, it was far too late. The moon and Erdtree united was a vision that only existed in Rennala's mind. To the being known as Marika/Radagon, it was just another day of administrative restructuring. Part 18. What that means for Rennala. For Rennala, the truth of Radagon's identity is the ultimate ontological horror. She was not abandoned for another woman, or for a kingdom, or even for a higher calling. She was abandoned so her husband could rejoin himself. This realization strips away any shred of agency or meaning from her years of marriage. Every child she bore, every spell she shared, and every moment of intimacy was a transaction designed to benefit the Golden Order. She was a biological resource to be exploited. She was a great queen who was treated as little more than a filing cabinet for lunar data and royal bloodlines. The abandonment left Rennala in a state of existential vacuum. If the man she loved was actually the goddess who sought to conquer her, then her entire life's work as a defender of Liurnia was a failure from the start. She had invited the enemy into her heart and her bed. This destroyed her mental fortitude, as it rendered her full moon wisdom useless. She couldn't have seen it coming, because Radagon was a fundamental break in the laws of nature. She was a mortal woman playing a game against a god who owned the board, the pieces, and the players. This betrayal turned her lunar light into a cold, dead vacuum. The abandonment was so absolute that it fractured her mind, leaving her incapable of processing the reality of her situation. She could not fight back against a husband who was also a god, so she retreated into the only thing he left her, the amber egg. She became a prisoner of the parting gift, clinging to the very object that proved she was nothing more than a temporary stop on Radagon's journey toward perfection. Rennala's tragedy is not just one of romance, but one of sovereignty. She was the most powerful sorcerer in the world, yet she was undone by the simplest of human weaknesses, the desire for companionship. The Golden Order used her own humanity against her, proving that her lunar independence was a fragile thing. What it means for Rennala is that she is the ultimate victim of the Erdtree's parasitic nature. She was hollowed out long before she became a boss in a video game. She was hollowed out the moment Radagon looked her in the eye and lied about who he was. Her withdrawal into the Grand Library was an admission of this defeat. She could no longer bear to look at the world she had failed to protect. She spent her days in a state of eternal rebirth, trying to create a new version of her life where the betrayal never happened. But the amber egg could only produce sweetings, flawed, mindless creatures that reflected her own shattered state. What it means for Rennala is that she is trapped in a loop of her own failure, eternally trying to birth a future from a past that was a lie. Finally, for Rennala, the abandonment meant the total loss of her identity as a Lunar Queen. She became the Queen of the Unborn, a title that mocks her inability to produce anything of lasting value. She is a figure of stagnation, a living monument to what happens when the moon tries to touch the sun. She is the queen who never recovered, not because she was weak, but because she was broken by a force that no mortal was ever meant to endure. She is the ghost of a civilization that was murdered by a marriage. Part 19. Mind Breaks. The psychological collapse of Rennala was not a sudden event, but a slow, grinding erosion of her personality. Grief, confusion, and the sheer weight of the abandonment led to a state of catatonia, where the Queen of the Moon ceased to function as a sentient leader. She stopped speaking to her advisors, stopped practicing her high-level sorceries, and focused her entire existence on the Amber Egg. Her mind broke in the sense that it could no longer reconcile the past, the beloved husband, with the present, the empty throne, and the silent egg. She entered a loop of obsessive, repetitive behavior, trying to find a solution to a problem that was unsolvable. This break manifested as an obsession with rebirth. If her life had been a lie, she would create a new life that was true. If her children had been taken or turned against her, she would create new sweetings who would never leave. This was not a maternal instinct, but a pathological refusal to accept the finality of her abandonment. Her obsession with the egg became a wall that blocked out the crumbling reality of Liurnia. She didn't notice the Cuckoo Knight's betrayal or the Academy's descent because she was busy trying to hatch a future that would never come. The break also stripped the Academy of its anchor. Rennala's charismatic power was the only thing holding the squabbling scholars together. When she stopped being a queen and started being a mourner, the intellectual structure of Raya Lucaria collapsed into vanity and pettiness. The full moon was eclipsed by a shadow of grief, and the grand library became a tomb for her former self. Rennala was physically alive, but the person who had conquered the Academy was dead, replaced by a hollowed-out vessel that could only whisper to a stone egg. The mind break was also a mechanical failure of her sorcery. Sorcery in the lands between is a product of intelligence, which requires a focused, coherent mind to interact with the glintstone. When Rennala's mind fractured, her magic became erratic and stunted. She could no longer summon the full moon in its true form, only a pale, flickering imitation of it. Her loss of mental clarity was a loss of power, leaving her vulnerable to the very scholars she had once bewitched. She was a master who had lost the key to her own magic. In this state, Rennala became a puppet of her own grief. She allowed the Academy to lock her away because she no longer cared about the world outside. Her mind break was a total surrender to the Amber Egg. She became the mother of a brood of failures, finding more comfort in the mindless crawling of the sweetings than in the complex reality of her kingdom. This was the ultimate victory for Radagon. He left her so broken that she became her own jailer, guarding a parting gift that was actually her coffin. The tragedy of the mind break is that it was a slow, agonizing process of erasure. It wasn't the shattering of a ring, but the cracking of a soul. Rennala spent years in that library, slowly losing the memories of who she was before the red-haired champion arrived. By the time the player finds her, there is nothing left but the obsession. She is a queen who has forgotten her crown, a sorcerer who has forgotten her stars, and a mother who has forgotten her children. She is the physical remains of a mind break that will never be healed. Part 20. The Amber Egg and the Rune of the Unborn. The Amber Egg is the physical manifestation of Rennala's stagnation. Containing the great rune of the unborn, it is a tool of metaphysical perfecting that is being used incorrectly by a broken mind. The rune is designed to govern the process of birth and rebirth, but without the proper larval tears or the mental stability of the caster, it produces only sweetings. Frail, short-lived, and mentally stunted scholars who crawl at the queen's feet. These beings are a mockery of life, representing Rennala's inability to move forward. She is trying to rebirth the past, but all she can produce are flawed, repetitive failures. Analytically, the egg functions as a security blanket for a dying civilization. It represents the refusal to accept the death of the Carian line. Every time Rennala performs a rebirth, she is attempting to reset the clock to a time before Radagon left. But because the rune is separated from the Elden Ring and held by a woman who is no longer whole, the process is corrupted. The Sweetings are the living proof of her failure. They have no legs, they cannot speak clearly, and they die almost immediately. They are the physical debris of a broken mind trying to play God. The presence of the egg in the Grand Library is also a mechanical anchor for the player. It is the only great rune that does not need to be activated at a divine tower, because it was never truly shattered. It was given. This suggests that Radagon's gift was a way to keep this specific power out of the hands of the other demigods. He parked a piece of the Elden Ring in the lap of a catatonic woman, knowing she was too broken to ever use it effectively against him. The Amber Egg is a cage, a curse, and a tragedy, all wrapped in a beautiful golden shell. The rune of the unborn also implies a tragic lack of potential. To be unborn is to be stuck in a state of pre-existence, never allowed to grow or evolve. This is exactly what happened to Liurnia after Radagon's departure. The kingdom was frozen in a state of mourning, unable to transition into a new era. The egg is the event horizon of Rennala's grief, a point from which no light or growth can escape. It is a biological black hole that consumes the resources of the Academy to produce nothing but shadows and cries. Furthermore, the egg is a constant reminder of the gold that Rennala was forced to keep. The amber colour is a direct link to the Erdtree, a visual stain on the blue and silver aesthetic of the Grand Library. Even in her deepest retreat, she cannot escape the influence of the man who left her. The rune of the unborn is a piece of Radagon's world that she cradles against her chest, unaware that it is the very thing that is preventing her from healing. It is a parasitic object that feeds on her desire for rebirth to maintain its own golden luster. Ultimately, the Amber Egg is the most successful weapon Radagon ever used. It didn't kill Rennala, but it ensured she would never be a threat. It turned the most powerful queen in history into a nursemaid for failures. The rune of the unborn is the symbol of a stolen future, a piece of a god left behind to make sure the moon never rises again. It is the ultimate parting gift, a treasure that is actually a terminal illness for a kingdom and its queen. The Knight of Black Knives was the ultimate mechanical failure of the Golden Order, orchestrated by Ranni as a desperate act of ontological secession. By stealing a fragment of the Rune of Death, Ranni didn't just commit a murder, she engineered a metaphysical paradox where her Empyrean flesh died while her soul remained intact. This was the only way to sever her connection to the Two Fingers and the Greater Will, which viewed her body as a biological vessel for their next age. For Rennala, this event was a catastrophic ripple of grief that finalized the destruction of her family. Her daughter had not only rejected the world, but had seemingly committed suicide, leaving behind only a cold, charred corpse at the top of a divine tower. Analytically, Ranni's actions were a direct response to the Radagon is Marika revelation and her mother's subsequent collapse. She saw that the gold would eventually consume every silver lineage if it were allowed to maintain its grip on the flesh of the world. By discarding her body, she was discarding the very heritage that Radagon had attempted to co-opt. The Night of Black Knives was a surgical strike against the concept of order itself, plunging the lands between into the chaos of the shattering. To Rani, the death of her body was a small price to pay for the ability to operate as a ghost in the machine, free from the influence of her father's fundamentalism. The impact on Rennala was transformative in the most negative sense. Already catatonic from Radagon's departure, the news of Rani's death accelerated her mental decay. She could not comprehend the complex, cosmic rebellion her daughter was leading. She only saw another empty seat at her table. The night proved that the Golden Order was not a protector of life, but a system that drove children to destroy themselves to escape its grasp. For the Carian line, this was the point of no return. The moon was no longer just lonely. It was eclipsed by the shadow of a daughter's cold, calculated suicide. Furthermore, Rani's rebellion effectively abandoned Rennala to her own madness. While Rani clearly cared for her mother, later manifesting a psychic projection to protect her, she prioritized her cosmic mission over her filial duties. She left her mother rotting in the Grand Library because she believed the only way to save the world was to walk a path of total darkness. This created a tragic hierarchy of needs where the daughter's ambition necessitated the mother's continued suffering. Rani became the witch, and Rennala became a relic of a discarded past, both of them victims of Radagon's original sin of abandonment. Mechanically, the theft of the Rune of Death introduced entropy back into a stagnant system. Rani's act broke the law of regression that Radagon had obsessed over, proving that things could indeed fall apart and stay apart. This was the intellectual antithesis of everything Radagon had tried to teach her in the Grand Library. Rani had taken her mother's lunar mystery and turned it into a weapon, using the dark of the moon to blind the Erdtree. She was no longer a Carian princess. She was a sovereign of the void, she operating on a level of cold logic that even her father could not have anticipated. The Night of Black Knives was the shattering before the shattering. It broke the divine family, it broke the laws of life and death, and it broke the last string of hope Rennala had for a reconciliation. It was the moment the Carian lineage stopped being a dynasty and started being a collection of ghosts. Rani's soul, now housed in a four-armed doll, became a silent observer of her mother's decline, a tragic monument to the fact that in the lands between, the only way to be free is to be dead in the eyes of the law. Part 22. Radan, the son who worshipped Radagon. General Radan, the Star Scourge, occupied a psychological space defined by an obsessive loyalty to the father who had deserted him. But despite his mother's collapse and the obvious betrayal of the Carian line, Radan chose to style himself after the Red Lion, adopting Radagon's red hair as a motif for his own armor and identity. This was a classic manifestation of identification with the aggressor, where the son seeks to master the pain of abandonment by becoming the very image of the one who left. Radan's devotion to the Golden Order was a desperate attempt to earn the approval of a man who was no longer there to give it. His mastery of gravity sorcery was a bridge between his two heritages, but he used it in service of the Golden Order's goals. By holding the stars in place, Radan was effectively halting the movement of fate, specifically the fate of the Carian family, which was tied to the movement of the stars. This mechanical intervention served the greater will by maintaining the stagnation of the world. He was a son using his mother's magic to enforce his father's order. This created a profound irony. The most physically powerful of the siblings was the one most enslaved to the memory of the man who had destroyed their home. Radagon's loyalty led him to become the ultimate champion of the Shattering, fighting to defend the Order, even as it was rotting from within. He viewed himself as the true heir to Radagon's martial legacy, seeing Ranni's rebellion and Rykard's blasphemy as failures of discipline. To Radagon, the red was more important than the silver. This internal bias caused him to remain a loyalist to a system that had already discarded his mother. He was the great lion who roared for a ghost, a tragic figure of immense strength and zero emotional clarity regarding his own family's ruin. The physical mutation of Radagon, his massive size, and his eventual descent into scarlet rot can be seen as a biological externalization of his internal conflict. He grew too large for the world, much like his father's ambitions grew too large for Liurnia. When he was finally consumed by millennia's rot, he became a mindless beast, wandering the dunes of Caelid. This was the final fate of the son who worshipped the father. He became a hollow shell of martial power, stripped of the intelligence that was his mother's gift. He was the red at its most grotesque and uncontrolled. Analytically, Radagon's role in the family was to be the shield of the Order. By holding the stars, he prevented Ranni from completing her mission and kept Rennala trapped in her eternal loop in the Grand Library. He was inadvertently the jailer of his own mother, ensuring that time never moved forward for her. His strength was the very thing that kept the Carian tragedy in a state of permanent suspension. He loved his father's image more than his mother's reality, and in doing so, he became a primary architect of the family's stagnation. When Radagon eventually falls to the player, the stars resume their movement, and the fate of the Carians is finally allowed to progress. His death is a mercy, but it is also the final removal of Radagon's influence from the physical world of the siblings. Radagon was the last piece of Radagon that still lived in the lands between, a violent, noble, and fundamentally misguided tribute to a man who was actually a god. With his passing, the Red Lion finally dies, leaving only the Dark Moon to settle the score. Part 23. Rykard's turn toward blasphemy. Rykard's trajectory from the Inquisitor to the Lord of Blasphemy was a direct result of his proximity to the Golden Order's hypocrisy. As a high-ranking official in the law-giving body of Leyndell, Rykard witnessed the cold, mechanical way his father and Marika managed the world. He saw that the law was not a moral truth, but a tool of suppression. Following Radagon's abandonment of his mother, Rykard's disillusionment turned into a proactive desire to devour the entire system. He retreated to Mount Gelmir and allowed himself to be consumed by the Great Serpent, an act of blasphemy that was intended to create a power capable of eating the gods themselves. This turn toward the Serpentine was a total rejection of the Golden and the Lunar alike. If the moon was too weak and the sun was too cruel, Rykard would choose the earth, the ancient chthonic power of the serpent that predated the Erdtree. This was a move of pure nihilism. Rykard didn't want to fix the world. He wanted to digest it. His blasphemy was a son's final, screaming no to the father who had treated him like a piece on a chessboard. By becoming a monster, Rykard ensured he could never be a part of Radagon's order again. The mechanical nature of Rykard's god-devouring was a biological horror that mirrored the parasitic nature of the Erdtree. Just as the Erdtree absorbed souls, Rykard absorbed champions, folding their strength into his own coiled mass. This was a dark reflection of Radagon's regression the idea that all things must return to one. Rykard simply chose a different, more visceral one to return to. He turned his inquisitorial zeal inward, hunting the servants of the greater will with a sadistic fury that spoke of deep, unresolved familial trauma. Rykard's abandonment of his human form was also an abandonment of his mother's dignity. He became a creature of magma and iron, a far cry from the refined, intellectual atmosphere of the Grand Library. While Ranni sought to transcend her flesh, Rykard sought to pervert it. He was the child of ambition gone wrong, a manifestation of what happens when a brilliant mind is given no outlet but destruction. His blasphemy was the loudest of the three siblings, a literal devouring of the legacy that Radagon had left behind. From an analytical standpoint, Rykard's rebellion was the most material of the three. Ranni operated in the spirit, Radagon in the stars, and Rykard in the stomach. He represents the physical rot of the family's legacy. His man-serpent children are a mockery of the sweetings his mother produced. Where Rennala's children were frail and short-lived, Rykard's were durable, predatory, and hungry. He replaced his mother's nursery of grief with a volcano of hate, turning the Carian name into a synonym for terror. When the player enters the Volcano Manor, they find the remains of a man who was once a prince of Liurnia. The blasphemy is complete. There is no longer a Rykard, only the serpent. His turn was the final proof that Radagon's attempt to complete himself through Rennala had only produced monsters. The gold had been smelted down into slag, and the silver had been tarnished beyond recognition. Rykard was the fire that burned the family tree to the ground, leaving only ash in his wake. Part 24. The Academy turns on the Queen. The imprisonment of Rennala by the Academy of Raya Lucaria was a cold, pragmatic betrayal that signalled the end of Carian sovereignty. Once it became clear that the Queen was no longer a functioning monarch, the Academy's leadership, specifically the various consorts and the Cuckoo Knights, decided that her presence was a hindrance to their survival. They locked her in the Grand Library, turning her sanctuary into a cell. This was not an act of malice so much as an act of institutional preservation. The Academy was cutting out its heart to save the rest of the body, unaware that the heart was the only thing keeping the body alive. This betrayal was fueled by years of resentment from the Cuckoo mercenaries, who had always viewed the Carian family as outsiders who had co-opted the Academy's resources. Without Radagon's military presence or Rennala's magical authority, there was nothing to stop the knights from seizing control. They turned their glintstone-tipped spears on the very royalty they had sworn to protect, proving that in Liurnia, knowledge was only as good as the power that enforced it. The Queen became a prisoner of the scholars, a reversal of the hierarchy that Rennala had worked so hard to establish. The imprisonment was also a form of intellectual censorship. By locking Rennala away, the Academy was attempting to bury the shame of her abandonment and the failure of the Golden Order marriage. They wanted to return to a state of pure glintstone study, free from the complications of Carian politics. But they found that without the Queen's full moon to guide them, their research became stagnant and repetitive. They were left with the sweetings and the amber egg, relics of a power they could not understand, and a queen they could not kill. Analytically, the Academy's turn represents the collapse of the meritocracy into a bunker mentality. The scholars stopped looking at the stars and started looking at the gates. They became obsessed with security and defense, sealing themselves off from the rest of the world. This isolation was a mirror of Rennala's own mental withdrawal. the entire institution became catatonic, trapped in a loop of guarding a prisoner who didn't even want to leave. The academy was no longer a place of learning. It was a glorified jail for a broken woman. The Cuckoo Knights became the de facto rulers of the lakes, but they were rulers without a purpose. They had no royalty to serve and no kingdom to expand. They spent their days patrolling the sunken ruins of Liurnia, fighting pointless skirmishes against the remnants of the Carian Manor forces. The betrayal had left the region in a power vacuum that could only be filled by the tarnished. The Academy's turn on the Queen was the final act of self-sabotage, ensuring that when the shattering came, Liurnia was already a dead land. By the time the player arrives, the Academy is a tomb. The turn was successful, but the victory was hollow. The scholars are mindless, the knights are predatory, and the Queen is a ghost. The imprisonment of Rennala was the moment the light of knowledge went out in the lands between, replaced by the flickering, sickly glow of the sweetings in the dark. The Academy had committed the ultimate academic error. They had mistaken the container, the library, for the content, the Queen. Part 25. Liurnia descends into civil war. The civil war that consumed Liurnia following Rennala's imprisonment was a chaotic, three-way conflict between the Academy, the Carian Manor, and the Knights of the Cuckoo. This was a war without a front line, fought in the shifting fogs and rising waters of the lakes. It was the physical manifestation of the shattered family. The Carian Manor, led by the few remaining loyalist knights and Egi, the war councillor, attempted to maintain a semblance of royal authority, while the Academy sought to purge all Carian influence. The Cuckoo Knights, meanwhile, simply fought for whoever offered the most glintstone or the best chance of survival. This war was particularly brutal because it was fought with the tools of enlightenment turned into tools of extinction. Glintstone sorcery, once a pursuit of the stars, was now used to melt flesh and shatter armor. The magic mirror and great blade phalanx became symbols of terror. The lakes were filled with the debris of a civilization that was eating itself. This was not a war of conquest, but a war of resentment. Every spell cast was a scream against the betrayal of the Golden Order and the collapse of the world. The Carian Manor became a besieged fortress, protected by magical traps and the sheer will of Rani's remaining servants. However, they were a dying breed, fighting a losing battle against the sheer numbers of the Academy and the Cuckoos. The manor, once a place of upper-level dignity, became a graveyard of Carian knights. This was the physical erasure of the Carian name from the map. The war was the final cleaning of the nest by the Cuckoo, leaving no room for the original inhabitants. Mechanically, the civil war resulted in the sinking of Liurnia. The maintenance of the levees and the magical barriers that kept the lakes in check was abandoned, leading to the flooding of the villages and the destruction of the lower-level academies. The region became a swamp, a place where life struggled to survive amidst the gold and silver rot. The war turned the jewel of the lands between into a gutter, proving that order cannot exist without a central, functioning mind. The Civil War also highlighted the total absence of the greater will. No grace came to save Liurnia. No fingers intervened to stop the slaughter. The region was left to rot, a discarded province that was no longer useful to the Golden Order. This was the final realization for the people of the lakes. They had been used by Radagon and then forgotten by Marika. The Civil War was the afterbirth of the marriage. A messy, violent process of a dead union being expelled from the world. When the dust finally settled, if it ever did, Liurnia was a land of ghosts. The civil war had no winner, only survivors who were too broken to care. The academy was sealed, the manor was a ruin, and the queen was in her cell. The descent into war was the final step in the ruin of Liurnia, a tragedy that began with a red-haired champion and ended with a flooded graveyard. The civil war was the proof that when the love story fails, the kingdom falls with it. Rennala's obsession with the amber egg is a pathological response to the trauma of abandonment, manifesting as a catastrophic misuse of the rune of the unborn. In her broken mental state, she views the rebirth process not as a clinical procedure for renewal, but as a way to populate her isolation with loyal, eternal infants. These sweetings are mindless, legless entities that exist in a state of perpetual dependency. This is the illusion of motherhood. She is not raising children. She is maintaining a nursery of biological failures to insulate herself from the fact that her real family has been destroyed. Analytically, the rebirth process is a failure because Rennala lacks the larval tears and the cognitive coherence required to anchor a soul in a new body. The resulting creatures are hollowed-out versions of the Academy's former scholars, stripped of their intelligence and reduced to crawling on the floor of the Grand Library. This is the ultimate degradation of the Academy's meritocratic ideals. The pursuit of the primeval current has been replaced by the pursuit of eternal infancy. Rennala is effectively recycling the remains of her kingdom to fuel her own delusions. The illusion of rebirth also serves as a mechanical defense for the queen. The sweetings act as a biological shield, singing and casting minor glintstone spells to protect their mother. They are a collective organism of grief, bound together by Rennala's desperate need to be needed. This cycle of birth and immediate decay is a microcosm of the lands between stagnation. Nothing truly grows. Nothing truly dies. It only reverts to a state of unborn potential that is never realized. For Rennala, the illusion is more real than the stone walls of her prison. She treats each sweeting with a tenderness that is both tragic and grotesque, whispering to them as if they were the children Radagon took away. She is attempting to overwrite the reality of her failure with a continuous loop of creation. But because she is using a great rune that she doesn't fully understand, the results are always the same: frail, short-lived, and meaningless. The illusion is a cage of her own making, a way to stay unborn herself. The presence of the sweetings also highlights the total collapse of the Academy's dignity. The floor of the Grand Library, once the site of the world's most advanced intellectual debates, is now covered in the slime of failed rebirths. The scholars have been turned into pets. This is the final victory of the amber egg over the glintstone. The queen has successfully replaced the rigorous logic of the moon with the chaotic, wet reality of the nursery. She is a goddess of failures, presiding over a kingdom of the incomplete. Ultimately, the illusion of rebirth is Rennala's final refusal to face the truth. If she accepts that the rebirths are failures, she has to accept that Radagon's gift was a curse. If she stops the cycle, she is alone in the dark. So she continues to cradle the egg, casting her magic into the void to produce more crawling reminders of her own broken heart. She is the queen of a nursery that is also a morgue, eternally rebirthing a past that died the moment Radagon walked out the door. Part 27, The Broken Nursery of Sweetings. The Grand Library of Raya Lucaria has been physically and functionally transformed into a broken nursery, a space where the pursuit of knowledge has been entirely displaced by the maintenance of biological stagnation. The air is thick with the scent of old paper and the stagnant fluids of the rebirth process. The sweetings, with their waxy skin and oversized heads, are the only inhabitants left in a room that once held the collective wisdom of the stars. This is no longer a place of learning. It is a warehouse for the physical debris of Rennala's grief. The mechanical failure of the sweetings, their lack of legs, and their inability to survive outside the library mirrors the geopolitical state of Liurnia. Just as the sweetings cannot walk, the kingdom cannot move forward. They are tethered to Rennala's presence, just as the land is tethered to its history. The broken nursery is a laboratory of regression, where the order of the Erdtree has been twisted into a perverse form of biological preservation. Every sweeting is a data point in the total collapse of the Carian intellectual legacy. Analytically, the nursery represents the death of the future. In a healthy society, children grow and surpass their parents. In Rennala's nursery, children are born as scholars who can only repeat the nursery rhymes of their mother. They are born old and die young. This is the logical conclusion of the Rune of the Unborn, a world where beginning and end are the same thing. The library has become a closed system of energy, recycling the same souls over and over into increasingly degraded forms. The behavior of the sweetings, their singing, and their rhythmic movement is a form of collective madness. They are not individuals. They are extensions of Rennala's broken will. They reflect her moods, becoming agitated when she is threatened and docile when she is calm. This is the ultimate control that the Golden Order sought, manifested in the most horrific way possible. The nursery is a place where the individual has been entirely erased in favor of a harmonious but mindless collective. The physical state of the library, shattered glass, piles of books used as bedding, and the dim, flickering light of glintstone lamps serves as a visual metaphor for the Carian mind. The nursery is a place of squalor disguised as sanctity. Rennala sits in the center of this chaos, oblivious to the fact that she is surrounded by the corpses of her own failed attempts to be a mother. The broken nursery is the final destination for the meritocracy of magic, a place where the only thing that matters is the Queen's comfort. When the player enters this space, they are intruding on a private, pathetic reality. The sweetings are not enemies in the traditional sense. They are obstacles in a hospital wing. The tragedy of the nursery is that it is the only place left in Liurnia that feels alive, yet that life is a mockery of everything the Carians once stood for. It is the final, stagnant pool of a river that has been dammed by the Golden Order. The broken nursery is the tomb of the Carian future, guarded by the ghost of its past. Part 28. Sorcery without sovereignty. In her current state, Rennala embodies the concept of sorcery without sovereignty. She possesses the most powerful magical artifacts in the world, the Carian Queen's staff and the full moon sorcery, but she has no will to direct them. Her magic has become a reactive, instinctive force rather than a tool of governance. She is a queen without a throne, sitting on the floor of a library that has become her cage. This is the ultimate defeat for a sorcerer, to have the power to change the world, but no longer the interest in doing so. This loss of sovereignty is reflected in the way the Academy functions without her. The scholars use her name and her image to maintain their own power, but they ignore her actual commands, if she even gives them. She has become a relic that is still technically functioning. a living engine of magic that is being harvested by the very people who imprisoned her. Her sorcery is used to power the Academy's defenses, but the Queen has no say in how those defenses are deployed. She is a battery for a machine she no longer controls. Analytically, sovereignty requires a finality of decision, something Rennala lost the moment Radagon left. Her mind break was an abdication of the self. Without a self, there can be no sovereign. She exists in a state of suspiration, a long, slow exhale that never ends. Her sorcery, which once dictated the movement of the stars over Liurnia, is now used to keep the library lamps lit and to soothe the crying of her sweetings. It is the trivialization of cosmic power. This state is also a commentary on the nature of glintstone as a source of power. Glintstone is a material that stores life energy from the stars, but it requires a human mind to give it shape. Without Rennala's sovereignty, the glintstone in Raya Lucaria has become wild. It manifests as environmental hazards and mindless projectiles. The sovereignty of the Carians was the only thing keeping the magic from consuming the land. With that sovereignty gone, the magic is slowly turning Liurnia into a crystalline graveyard. The contrast between her former glory and her current state is the core of the tragedy. She still wears the robes of the Lunar Queen, but they are tattered and stained. She still holds the amber egg, but it is a symbol of her subjugation. Sorcery without sovereignty is a state of living death, where the body continues to cast spells, but the spirit has already fled. Rennala is a monument to the fact that power without purpose is just a form of slow-motion destruction. When the player faces her, they are not fighting a queen, they are fighting a mechanism. The first phase of the boss fight is a puzzle of biological management, as the player has to cull the sweetings to reach the source of the shield. This is the final degradation of the Carian line. The Great Queen is reduced to a boss mechanic in a dungeon. She has lost her sovereignty so completely that she doesn't even recognize the player as a threat. She only sees them as a disturbance in her nursery. Part 29. Radagon's return to Leyndell. While Rennala was rotting in the Grand Library, Radagon's return to Leyndell marked the final consolidation of the Golden Order's power. He was elevated to the status of Elden Lord, the king consort to Queen Marika. This was the moment the red-haired champion was officially deified. His identity merged into the very fabric of the world's governance. He spent this time physically and metaphorically repairing the Golden Order, attempting to fix the inconsistencies he had discovered during his time in Liurnia. He was no longer a man, he was a fundamentalist icon. The marriage to Marika was the ultimate act of regression. If Radagon and Marika are indeed the same being, then the marriage was a divine self-correction, a folding of the separated aspects back into a single, rigid order. This left no room for the silver of Liurnia or the mystery of the moon. Radagon's return was a statement that the Carian experiment was over. He brought with him the secrets of sorcery and integrated them into the Golden Order fundamentalism, effectively stripping Liurnia of its intellectual monopoly. Analytically, Radagon's time in Leyndell was spent in a state of frantic, golden repair. He sensed the coming shattering and tried to prevent it through the sheer force of his law. He created the Radagon's icon and the Golden Order totality, trying to prove that everything could be unified under the Erdtree. But his perfection was a lie built on the abandonment of his family. He was a lord who had abandoned his duties as a father and a husband, a hypocrisy that would eventually lead to the total collapse of his system. The contrast between the Grand Library and the Elden Throne is the visual representation of the tragedy. One is a room of shadows and failed births. The other is a seat of radiant, artificial light. Radagon sat on that throne, presiding over a world that was rapidly falling apart, while his former wife sat on the floor of a library, cradling a piece of him. This is the dual reality of the Radagon is Marika revelation. The god is on the throne, and the victim is in the jail, and they are both bound by the same red-haired ghost. Radagon's marriage to Marika also finalized the orphanage of his children. Radan, Rykard, and Rani were now the demigod children of the second Elden Lord, a title that came with immense responsibility but zero paternal support. Radagon's return was a rejection of his human legacy in favor of his divine one. He chose the system over the soul, a choice that defined the end of the world. He was the perfect king who had failed at the most basic level of human connection. Ultimately, Radagon's return to Leyndell was the final move in the conquest of Liurnia. He didn't need to stay in the lakes once he had what he wanted. He moved back to the center of the world, leaving the moon to fade in the distance. His success as an Elden Lord was built on the wreckage of Rennala's life. He was the Red Lion who had finally returned to his den, leaving a trail of silver blood behind him. Part 30. The Shattering of the Elden Ring. The shattering of the Elden Ring was the macrocosmic echo of Rennala's personal shattering. When Marika took her hammer to the ring, she was not just breaking a physical object. She was breaking the order that Radagon had spent his life building. This was the ultimate betrayal of Radagon by Marika, the self turning on the self. The resulting chaos destroyed the lands between, but for Liurnia, it was merely the final confirmation of a ruin that had begun years prior. The shattering was the moment the lie of the Golden Order was finally exposed to the world. For Rennala, the shattering was a distant thunder that she barely perceived. The world was ending, but her world had ended when Radagon walked out. The great runes were distributed among the demigods, her children included, further fragmenting her family. Radan took a rune to Caelid, Rykard took one to Mount Gelmir, and Rani stole one and cast it aside. The shattering turned her children into warlords, forcing them into a conflict that would eventually lead to their grotesque mutations and deaths. The family was not just shattered, it was weaponized against itself. Analytically, the shattering represents the total failure of integration. The Golden Order could not hold the moon and the sun together, so the ring broke. The regression that Radagon sought was impossible, as the universe itself rejected the rigidity of his law. The shattering was the entropy that Rani had sought, the blasphemy that Rykard had embraced, and the tragedy that Radan had tried to prevent. It was the physical manifestation of the Carian family's internal collapse. The mechanical impact of the shattering on Liurnia was the total withdrawal of grace. The guidance that had once led people to the academy was gone, replaced by the mindless hunger of the tarnished. The shattering turned the lakes into a hunting ground. The civil war that had been a local conflict became part of a global war of the runes. Rennala, holding the rune of the unborn, became a target for every ambitious warrior in the lands between. Yet she remained oblivious to the target on her back. The shattering also proved that Radagon's perfection was a fraud. He tried to repair the ring as Marika was shattering it, a divine struggle that left them both trapped inside the Erdtree as a charred, broken husk. This is the final symmetry. Radagon left Rennala in a library with a broken mind, and Marika left Radagon in a tree with a broken body. The Order had consumed everyone involved, leaving nothing but fragments and shadows. When the Elden Ring broke, the Carian love story was officially erased from the history of the world. It was no longer a story of two monarchs, but it was a footnote in the war of the demigods. The shattering was the final blow to the Silver Age of Liurnia, ensuring that the fog would never lift and the Queen would never recover. It was the end of the world, but for Rennala, it was just another day in the nursery, cradling the parting gift of a god who had finally broken everything. Section 7. Love, Identity, and Ruin. Part 31. Was Radagon capable of love? The question of Radagon's emotional capacity hinges on whether he possessed a distinct soul or was merely a biological extension of Marika's will. If he was always order incarnate, then his marriage to Rennala was not a romantic union, but a strategic annexation of a rival power. In this view, his affection was a simulated performance designed to penetrate the Carian defenses through intimacy rather than warfare. Every gesture of devotion would then be reclassified as a calculation, a cold assessment of how best to integrate the logic of sorcery into the fundamentalism of the Erdtree. However, the physical evidence of his departure suggests a profound internal conflict. Just the fact that he left behind the Amber Egg and a legendary sword implies a desire to provide some form of stability or remembrance for the woman he abandoned. If he were purely a machine of law, such sentimental gestures would be unnecessary and inefficient. This suggests that during his time in Liurnia, Radagon may have developed a secondary identity that was capable of human attachment, only to have that identity forcibly suppressed when the call to return to Leyndell arrived. The tragedy of Radagon is that his nature as a fundamentalist requires the total rejection of individual desire in favor of regression to the One. If he did love Rennala, that love was a heresy against his own purpose. To be a perfect tool of the greater will, he had to excise the parts of himself that felt kinship with the moon. This creates a portrait of a man who was a prisoner of his own divinity, forced to betray his own heart to satisfy the structural requirements of the Elden Ring. His capacity for love was likely real, but it was ultimately irrelevant to the cosmic role he was forced to play. From the perspective of the Carians, the distinction between a cold god and a conflicted man is academic. The result was the same: the total abandonment of a partner and a kingdom. If Radagon was capable of love, it makes his betrayal even more heinous, as it implies he knew the depth of the pain he was about to inflict. If he was only order incarnate, he is merely a force of nature, devoid of malice, but also devoid of mercy. The ambiguity of his character is the primary engine of the Liurnian tragedy. Furthermore, his later actions as Elden Lord show a man obsessed with repairing what was broken, perhaps a subconscious attempt to fix the world in the way he could not fix his family. His devotion to the Golden Order became more rigid and fanatical after leaving Liurnia, which may have been a psychological defense mechanism to justify his abandonment of Rennala. By convincing himself that the Order was the only thing that mattered, he could stifle the lingering echoes of his time in the Grand Library. Ultimately, Radagon represents the horrific intersection of the personal and the divine. He was a being who tried to bridge two worlds and ended up shattering both. Whether he was capable of love is less important than the fact that he chose law over life. He walked out of the library and into the Erdtree, leaving behind a woman who would spend eternity trying to find the man she thought she knew in the cold surface of a stone egg. Part 32. Rennala's tragedy versus Marika's ambition. The contrast between Rennala and Marika is a study in the difference between a sovereign of the heart and a sovereign of the world. Rennala's tragedy is rooted in her vulnerability. She allowed her power to be anchored in her relationships, making her strength contingent on the presence of her family. When that anchor was removed, her entire reality collapsed. She is a queen defined by her loss, a master of the stars who was blinded by the simple human need for companionship. Her story is one of a brilliant light that was extinguished by the cold winds of desertion. Marika, by contrast, she is defined by an ambition so vast it transcends the concepts of family and morality. Where Rennala sought to build a kingdom through marriage and intellectual mastery, Marika sought to rewrite the laws of existence itself. She viewed people, including her own children and her other self, Radagon, as mere instruments in a grand architectural project. Marika's ambition required the sacrifice of everything human within her, turning her into a hollowed vessel for the greater will, yet one that still possessed enough agency to eventually plot the destruction of her own order. The two queens represent the two possible fates of power in the lands between. Rennala represents the path of the lunar reflection, which is beautiful and profound, but ultimately fragile when the light it reflects is withdrawn. So Marika represents the path of radiant control, which is absolute and terrifying, but leads to a state of eternal, agonizing stagnation. Rennala is a victim of the system Marika created, a side effect of a divine expansion that had no room for the sovereignty of the individual. While Rennala retreated into a nursery to mourn her life, Marika ascended to the height of the Erdtree to challenge her god. This difference in response to crisis highlights their fundamental natures. Rennala is a creature of emotion and memory, while Marika is a creature of strategy and defiance. Even in her broken state, Marika is an active participant in the fate of the world, whereas Rennala has become a passive relic. The tragedy of the Carrion Queen is that she was too human for a world ruled by a woman who had long since discarded her humanity. The interaction between their two lives is what created the modern state of Liurnia. Marika's need for Radagon's return was the catalyst for Rennala's mind break. It was Marika's ambition that dictated the terms of Radagon's departure, showing that even the most intimate moments of Rennala's marriage were subject to the whims of the goddess in Leyndell. Rennala was a queen playing at a game of love, while Marika was playing a game of cosmic dominion, and the disparity between those two stakes ensured Rennala's total defeat. In the end, Marika's ambition proved to be just as destructive to herself as Rennala's tragedy was to her. Both queens ended up imprisoned, one in a library of her own grief, the other in the heart of a parasitic tree. They are the two bookends of the Golden Age, and representing the failure of both love and power to provide a stable foundation for the world. Their shared legacy is a land of orphans and ruins, a testament to the fact that whether one chooses the heart or the crown, the greater will eventually claims everything. Part 33, The Moon and the Erdtree. The symbolism of the moon and the Erdtree establishes a fundamental metaphysical tension between cold reflection and radiant control. The moon, the source of Carrion power, represents a mystery that is observed and understood through intelligence and distance. It does not demand worship. It offers wisdom to those with the clarity to look upon it. It is a force of the night, emphasizing the hidden, the internal, and the intellectual. For Rennala, the moon was a guide that allowed for a plurality of thought and a meritocracy of sorcerous achievement. The Erdtree, conversely, is a symbol of absolute, intrusive light. It provides grace and life, but it demands total adherence to its law. It is a sun that never sets, illuminating everything so that nothing can remain hidden or independent. Its control is radiant, reaching into the very souls of the inhabitants of the lands between to dictate the terms of their life and death. While the moon is a cold reflection of the cosmic void, the Erdtree is a burning assertion of divine presence, an order that seeks to eliminate all shadows. When Radagon and Rennala married, it was an attempt to synchronize these two opposing symbols. The union suggested that the radiant control of the Erdtree could find a place for the cold reflection of the moon. This period of peace was a celestial anomaly, a moment where the night and day existed in balance. However, the inherent nature of the Erdtree is to consume and unify. It cannot allow a rival source of light to exist indefinitely. The marriage was not a merger of equals, but a slow process of the sun swallowing the moon. The failure of the union proved that the two symbols are ultimately incompatible. The Erdtree's logic of regression seeks to return all things to a singular point of gold, while the moon's logic of discovery seeks to explore the infinite reaches of the stars. One is centripetal, pulling everything inward toward a central authority. The other is centrifugal, pushing outward toward the unknown. This philosophical divergence made the eventual collapse of the Carian-Lendel peace inevitable. The radiant control of the Erdtree eventually demanded the total submission of the lunar mystery. For the people of Liurnia, the transition from the moon to the Erdtree was a transition from freedom to dogma. The cold reflection of the moon allowed for the development of individual genius in the academy, whereas the radiant control of the Erdtree demanded the sterile uniformity of fundamentalist incantations. When the moon faded from the grand library, the light that replaced it was not the warm grace of the tree, but the sickly, artificial glow of the amber egg. The night had been lost, but the day that followed was a fever dream of stagnation. Ultimately, the moon remains as a symbol of what was lost. Even in the dark, it continues to hang over the lakes, a reminder of a sovereignty that was once absolute. The Erdtree continues to tower over the horizon, a monument to a control that is now shattered but still heavy. The history of Liurnia is the history of a cold light that was tricked into believing it could share the sky with a jealous sun. The result was a world where the stars are fixed in place, and the moon is nothing but a memory held by a broken queen. Part 34. The Rune of the Unborn as Denial. The Rune of the Unborn, contained within the amber egg, serves as a metaphysical anchor for Rennala's refusal to move forward. As a shard of the Elden Ring that governs the process of rebirth, it should technically be a tool for evolution and change. However, in Rennala's hands, it has been perverted into an instrument of pure denial. She uses its power to recreate the same flawed, infantile beings over and over, effectively trapping her corner of the world in a state of pre-existence. The rune is not being used to create new life, but to prevent the death of the old. This denial is a direct response to the finality of Radagon's departure. By obsessing over the process of birth, Rennala can ignore the reality of her abandonment. If she can eternally rebirth her sweetlings, she can maintain the illusion that time has stopped and that her nursery is a sanctuary from the crumbling world outside. The rune of the unborn allows her to exist in a perpetual present, where the trauma of the past is drowned out by the cries of the newly born. It is a mechanical solution to an emotional wound that refuses to heal. Analytically, the rune represents the dark side of the Golden Order's obsession with eternity. If death is removed from the equation, life becomes a stagnant loop. Rennala's use of the rune is the ultimate expression of this stagnation. She is trying to birth a future that is exactly like the past, a goal that results in the grotesque, legless scholars that populate the library floor. This is the biological cost of denial, a life that is technically functional but fundamentally broken, incapable of standing on its own or progressing beyond the nursery. The rune also acts as a wall between Rennala and her actual children. While Rani, Radagon, and Rykard moved out into the world to meet their fates, Rennala stayed behind to care for her unborn surrogates. The rune allowed her to replace her real, complicated offspring with a brood of compliant and mindless infants who would never leave her. This is the most tragic form of denial, as it signifies a mother choosing a comfortable lie over the painful truth of her family's dissolution. The amber egg is the coffin of her maternal ambition. For the tarnished, the rune of the unborn is a functional utility, a way to reset their own path. But for the world of Liurnia, it is the source of its paralysis. As long as the rune is held in the Grand Library, the cycle of the Carian lineage cannot conclude. The land remains in a state of suspended animation, much like the fog that never lifts from the lakes. The denial is so absolute that it has permeated the very atmosphere, turning the center of learning into a center of arrested development. Ultimately, from the rune of the unborn is the final gift of a man who knew exactly how to keep a woman quiet. Radagon didn't give her the rune to empower her. He gave it to her to distract her. He gave her a toy that would allow her to play at being a creator, while he went off to be the lord of the world. The rune of the unborn is the physical manifestation of a husband's contempt, repurposed by a wife into a lifelong prayer of denial. It is the most beautiful and most horrific object in the Grand Library. Part 35. The Children as Fractured Reflections. The three children of Radagon and Rennala, Rani, Radagon, and Rykard, serve as fractured reflections of their parents' broken marriage. Each child inherited a different aspect of the union's conflicting ideologies, and each was ultimately destroyed or transformed by the impossibility of reconciling them. They are the living debris of a collision between the moon and the Erdtree, forced to carry the weight of a heritage that was built on a lie. Their lives are the various ways a soul can break when its foundation is a desertion. Rani inherited the lunar mystery and the intellectual independence of her mother, but she tempered it with the cold, strategic ruthlessness of her father. She is the reflection of the marriage's intellectual peak, the one who realized that the only way to save the soul was to destroy the body. Her rebellion is a direct critique of her parents' failure. She saw that the union of gold and silver was a cage, and she chose the dark moon instead. Rani is the daughter who moved beyond the nursery by burning the world down, a chilling reflection of the Carian desire for sovereignty. Radagon inherited the martial prowess and the fundamentalist loyalty of his father, yet he applied it to the gravitational sorceries of his mother's people. He is the reflection of the marriage's outward strength, a champion who loved the image of the Golden Order so much that he became its ultimate defender. His tragedy is that he worshipped the father who left him, turning himself into a monument to a man who didn't care for him. Radagon is the son who tried to hold the stars in place to keep his mother's world from ending, only to be consumed by the rot of the father's world. Rykard inherited the inquisitorial zeal and the structural ambition of the Golden Order, but he turned it into a blasphemous hunger that rejected both his parents. He is the reflection of the marriage's hidden resentment, the sun who saw the hypocrisy of the gods and decided to devour them. Rykard's transformation into a serpent is the ultimate rejection of the human form that tied him to his lineage. He represents the total collapse of the Carian dignity into a visceral, predatory nihilism. Together, the three siblings represent the total fragmentation of a legacy. There is no unity between them, only a shared origin and a shared doom. They did not work together to save their mother or restore their kingdom. They went their separate ways, each trying to solve the problem of their existence in a different, radical way. They are the shattered shards of the Elden Ring, manifested in flesh and blood. Their inability to find a common path is the final proof that the marriage of Radagon and Rennala was a failure of the soul. In the end, the children are the most damning evidence against Radagon. He produced three of the most powerful beings in the history of the lands between, and then he left them to navigate the wreckage of his ambition alone. They are reflections of a father who was a god and a mother who was a ghost. When the Tarnished eventually encounters each of them, they are not fighting heroes. They are fighting the various ways a family can rot from the inside out. The children are the ruin of the kingdom made manifest. The entry of the Tarnished into the Grand Library marks the final intrusion of reality into Rennala's sanctuary of denial. After fighting through the remnants of a dead academy, the Tarnished finds not a formidable adversary, but a scene of domestic horror. The library, once a center of cosmic study, is now a cluttered, stagnant nursery. The queen is not sitting on a throne, but floating in a golden sphere of her own making, surrounded by the legless scholars she calls her children. The Tarnished's arrival is the sound of a clock finally starting to tick again in a room where time had been held hostage. The sight of the fallen queen is a moment of profound anticlimax. There is no martial challenge in the first encounter, only the grim task of culling the mindless sweetlings to break the queen's protective shell. This is the final degradation of the Carian royalty. The Great Queen has been reduced to a target in a game of biological attrition. The Tarnished is forced to witness the depth of her madness, the way she speaks to the Amber Egg as if it were a living thing, and the total absence of the warrior queen who once led the Glintstone Knights into battle. Analytically, the Tarnished represents the external force of change that the Rune of the Unborn was designed to prevent. By entering the library, the Tarnished is breaking the isolation that allowed Rennala's delusions to flourish. They are the wind that blows the fog away, revealing the rot beneath. The encounter is a clash between a person of the present and a person of a dead past. The Tarnished has no interest in the nursery rhymes or the grief. They are there for the Great Rune, a pragmatic goal that ignores the human tragedy of the room. The presence of the Tarnished also highlights the total failure of the Academy's defenses. The Cuckoo Knights and the Glintstone Seals were meant to keep the world out, but they were also keeping the Queen in. The Tarnished's entry is a liberation that feels like an execution. For the first time in centuries, Rennala is forced to see someone who is not a creation of her own mind, or a sycophant of her broken court. The library doors open to reveal that the world has moved on, and it has come to collect the last pieces of her life. As the Tarnished moves across the velvet carpet, stepping over the discarded books and the crawling scholars, the atmosphere is one of profound exhaustion. The library is tired of being a nursery. The scholars are tired of being reborn. The Tarnished is the only thing in the room with a will, and that will is focused on the destruction of the status quo. The encounter with the fallen queen is the moment the Liurnian drama stops being a ghost story and starts being a historical record. The past is finally being forced to give up its secrets. Ultimately, the entry of the Tarnished is the beginning of the end for the Carian stagnation. Whether through violence or through the simple act of taking the rune, the Tarnished is the catalyst that will finally allow Rennala's story to conclude. As they stand before the Golden Sphere, the Tarnished is not just a warrior, but a witness to the final, pathetic moments of a dynasty that tried to marry a god and ended up losing its mind in a library. Part 37, Rennala's second phase, Illusion of Power. When Rennala is finally struck down, the battle does not end. It is hijacked by the psychic intervention of her daughter, Ranni. This second phase is not a fight against the woman in the room, but against a spectral memory of her at the height of her power. Ranni's voice echoes through the library, warning the Tarnished that they shall not disturb her mother's slumber. This is the illusion of power, a high-level magical projection designed to protect the fragile reality of the present with the formidable image of the past. It is the daughter's final gift to a mother she has already moved beyond. The spectral Rennala that emerges is a being of pure lunar radiance, standing tall and wielding the Carian Queen's staff with terrifying precision. She summons the spirits of the Carian knights and the giants of the lakes, recreating the battles of the conquest within the confines of the library. This phase of the fight is a display of what Rennala should have been, a haunting what if that mocks the reality of the broken woman on the floor. It is a masterpiece of magical defense, using the Tarnished's own sense of awe and fear as a weapon against them. Analytically, this illusion is Ranni's way of maintaining the dignity of the Carian name. She knows her mother is a shell, but she refuses to let the world see her that way. By manifesting this projection, Ranni ensures that the final memory the world has of the Lunar Queen is one of power and majesty, not of grief and sweetlings. It is a form of narrative control, an attempt to rewrite the ending of the Carian tragedy into a heroic stand. The illusion is a shield not for her mother's body, but for her mother's legacy. The irony of the second phase is that the power being used to protect the Queen is the very power she was too broken to use herself. Ranni is utilizing the dark moon to simulate the full moon, a blending of their identities that emphasizes the daughter's role as the true heir to the Carian spirit. The spectral Rennala is a puppet controlled by a ghost, a multi-layered deception that reflects the complex, fragmented nature of the family. The Tarnished is fighting a memory that has been sharpened into a blade. The mechanical shift in the fight is a transition from the biological squalor of the nursery to the cosmic beauty of the lunar void. The library disappears, replaced by a dark ocean under a giant moon. This is the world as Rennala once saw it, a place of infinite potential and cold, intellectual clarity. And by forcing the Tarnished into this space, Ranni is trying to drown them in the sheer scale of the Carian history. It is a desperate, beautiful, and ultimately futile attempt to preserve a dream that has already been shattered. When the illusion is finally defeated, it dissolves into mist, leaving the real Rennala untouched and catatonic. The fight proves that while Ranni can simulate her mother's power, she cannot restore her mother's soul. The illusion of power was a momentary flicker of light in a long, dark night. As the spectral moon fades, the reality of the library returns, more silent and more empty than before. The daughter's protection has failed, and the mother is left alone with her egg. Part 38, Radagon's final form. The final encounter with Radagon at the heart of the Erdtree is the ultimate resolution of the man who started the Liurnian ruin. He is no longer the red-haired champion of Rennala's memories. He is a charred, crumbling husk, a literal vessel for the Elden Ring. His body is a fractured shell of stone and gold, showing the physical toll of being a god's other half. He stands as the final gatekeeper, a silent, mindless defender of an order that has already failed. This is the man for whom a queen broke her heart, revealed at last to be nothing more than a broken tool. Radagon's final form is a study in the horror of totality. He has no voice, no expression, and no humanity left. He is a fundamentalist construct, moving with mechanical precision to enforce the laws of a crumbling reality. The hammer he wields, the same one used by Marika to shatter the ring, and by himself to try and repair it, is a symbol of his dual role as creator and destroyer. He is the personification of the Golden Order's refusal to die, a zombie of order that would rather burn the world than let it change. The contrast between Radagon and Rennala in their final states is profound. Rennala is a prisoner of her internal grief, while Radagon is a prisoner of external law. She retreated into a nursery. He was absorbed into a tree. Both are shells, but while she is filled with the echoes of a lost love, he is filled with the radiance of a parasitic god. The man who walked out of the Grand Library didn't find glory. He found a state of eternal, agonizing service. His abandonment of his family led him to a fate far worse than the one he left behind. As the Tarnished fights Radagon, they are fighting the very concept of the marriage of gold and silver. Radagon's attacks are a blend of holy incantations and the structural logic he mastered in Liurnia. He is the synthesis of all the themes of the game, a being who tried to master everything and ended up becoming a slave to a singular vision. To defeat him is to finally conclude the story that began in the lakes. The red-haired problem is finally solved by the death of the man who carried it. The mechanical difficulty of the fight highlights the sheer weight of the order Radagon represents. He is durable, relentless, and unforgiving. He does not bargain or plead. He simply exists to prevent the Tarnished from reaching the end. This is the ultimate form of the denial that Rennala practiced in her library. Radagon is the cosmic version of the Amber Egg, a protective shell around a dead core. Breaking him is the final requirement for the world to move on from the age of the Erdtree. When Radagon falls and is consumed by the Elden beast, the man is finally gone. There is no deathbed confession, no recognition of his children, and no word for the wife he left behind. He dies as a function, not a person. This is the final cold truth of the Carian tragedy. The man Rennala loved wasn't just a god in disguise. He was a god who had no room for a man's heart. The finale of Radagon is a pile of ash in the center of a burning tree, a silent end to a loud and violent history. Part 39. The love story that broke a kingdom. The ruin of Liurnia can be traced directly back to a single emotional event, the abandonment of Rennala by Radagon. What was once the most prosperous and intellectually advanced region of the lands between was reduced to a flooded graveyard of scholars because its queen could not survive the end of her marriage. The love story was the foundation of the kingdom's stability, and when it cracked, the entire political and social structure followed. Liurnia is a case study in how the personal failings of the powerful can lead to the systemic collapse of a civilization. The political fracture of the academy and the rise of the Cuckoo Knights were direct consequences of Rennala's mental withdrawal. A state that relies on the charismatic authority of a single monarch cannot survive that monarch's catatonia. Radagon's departure didn't just break a heart, It created a power vacuum that was filled by greed, resentment, and violence. The civil war that turned the lakes into a swamp was the physical manifestation of a husband's desertion. The love story was the glue, and without it, the pieces fell apart and were washed away by the tide. Analytically, the story is a critique of the great man or great queen theory of history. The fate of thousands of scholars and knights was tied to the emotional health of a woman who was too vulnerable to her own feelings. The marriage was a strategic alliance that lacked a contingency plan for its dissolution. When Radagon was called back to Leyndell, there was no transition of power, no deputy to take the reins, only a nursery and an egg. The kingdom's ruin was baked into its structure the moment it allowed its sovereignty to be defined by a romance. The legacy of this broken story is the tarnish that covers the entire region. The sunken houses of the Academy Gate Town and the mindless state of the mages are the long-term symptoms of a sudden, violent divorce. Liurnia is haunted by the ghost of a peace that was too good to be true. The love story was a Trojan horse for the Golden Order, a way to conquer a people by making their queen fall in love with the enemy. Once the gates were open, the lover left, and the kingdom was sacked by its own shadows. For the tarnished, the ruin of Liurnia is a landscape to be looted, but for the law, it is a tragedy of identity. The Carians lost their identity as independent masters of the stars when they tied themselves to the Erdtree. When the Erdtree pulled away, it took the Carian sense of self with it. The ruin is the physical space where a civilization used to be, before it was hollowed out by a god's whim. The lakes are the tears of a kingdom that forgot to be a kingdom and tried to be a family instead. Ultimately, the love story that broke a kingdom is the core narrative of the Carian line. It is a story of how intimacy can be a weapon of war. Radagon conquered Liurnia more effectively through a wedding than he ever could have through a siege. The ruin of the lakes is the final monument to his victory. The love story is over, and all that is left is the debris. A broken queen, a sunken town, and a daughter who had to kill her own body to escape the wreckage. Part 40. The Queen Who Never Recovered. The story of Rennala ends in a quiet, slow reflection of total stagnation. While the Tarnished goes on to mend the Elden Ring or usher in an age of stars, Rennala remains in the Grand Library, cradling her stone egg. She is the only major character who does not find a resolution, a death, or a transformation. She is simply there, a permanent feature of the landscape, like the mountains or the lakes. She is the queen who never recovered, a living testament to the fact that some wounds are so deep they become a part of the geography. Her presence in the library after the battle is one of the most haunting sights in the game. She is peaceful, in a way, but it is the peace of a void. She will allow you to rebirth yourself. She will speak of her sweetlings, and she will maintain her nursery until the end of time. She has reached a state of terminal stability where no further growth or decay is possible. She is the unborn made manifest, a being who has retreated so far into the past that the present can no longer touch her. She is the quiet at the center of the storm. Analytically, Rennala represents the human cost of the cosmic drama. While the gods and demigods fight over runes and thrones, she is the one left behind to deal with the emotional fallout. She is the collateral damage of Marika's ambition and Radagon's duty. Her failure to recover is a silent protest against a world that treats people as resources. By staying in her library and refusing to move on, she remains a constant, uncomfortable reminder of what the Golden Order did to the people it was supposed to protect. The tragedy of her lack of recovery is that she was once so much more. The legendary sorcerer, the warrior queen, the master of the moon, all of that is gone, replaced by a nursemaid of shadows. This slow closing reflection on her life is a reminder that in the lands between, power is no protection against the breaking of the heart. Her story is a downward arc that ends in a flat line. She is the moon that stayed below the horizon, never to rise again, leaving the world to the harsh light of a new age. In the final assessment, Rennala is perhaps the most relatable character in the mythos. She didn't want to be a god or a serpent or a star scourge. She just wanted to be a wife and a mother. Her tragedy is the most human because it is based on the most common of betrayals. The queen who never recovered is a reflection of everyone who has ever been left behind by a world that values greatness over goodness. She is the shadow in the library that the new Elden Lord must ignore as they take the throne. The last image of the Carian story is a soft blue glow in a high tower, surrounded by the fog of the lakes. The queen sits in her chair, whispering to an egg that will never hatch, waiting for a man who will never return. The stars continue to move, the Erdtree continues to burn, and the Tarnished continues to fight. But in the grand library of Raya Lucaria, the silence is absolute. Rennala has found her peace in the only way she knew how, by forgetting that there was ever anything else to find.